Welcome to Somewhere Along the Way. I'm Dennis, and I'm glad you found your way here. Every story you'll hear on this channel is written and narrated by me. Some drawn from memory, others inspired by the people, places, and moments that have stayed with me over the years. This channel, it's simply a place to slow down for a little while, to remember, to reflect, and to enjoy a good story. So, wherever you're listening from, please know, I'm really glad that you're here. Let's jump right in to today's story. A few weeks ago, I was driving home just as the workday was winding down. It was around 6 o'clock, and, if you've ever lived in Phoenix, you know that 6 o'clock in July doesn't really mean evening. The sun is still high, the pavement is still giving off heat, and anything made of metal is waiting for the chance to remind you why you shouldn't touch it with your bare hands. I pulled up to a red light and happened to glance over toward the sidewalk. Two boys, maybe 12 years old, were pushing an e-bike along the side of the road. Something had broken. From where I was sitting, it looked like the drive belt had come off. One of them had both hands on the handlebars, leaning into that bike as they walked. The other was talking on a cell phone with the kind of animated enthusiasm only a 12-year-old can seem to manage. Every few seconds, they'd both start laughing about something, then keep right on walking as though pushing a broken bike across town was just another thing to do on a Tuesday afternoon. They didn't look worried. They didn't look frustrated. In fact, if anything, they looked like they were having a pretty good time. The light turned green, and they disappeared into my rearview mirror. And just like that, I was 12 years old again. It's funny how the mind works. We don't decide what we're going to remember. We don't decide when we're going to remember it. Sometimes all it takes is a smell. Sometimes an old song on the radio. And every once in a while, it's simply two boys pushing a broken bicycle down the side of the road. It was 1982. The 4th of July had only been over for a few days. Back then, summer vacation still felt endless. The neighborhood had settled back into its normal rhythm after the weekend. Both of my parents were at work. My sisters, they were off doing whatever girls did all summer long. Honestly, I couldn't have told you where they were if someone had asked me. The house was mine until dinner, or at least until somebody came home around 6. And that was pretty normal in those days. I had recently gotten my little dirt bike running again, and I'd been looking for an excuse to ride it. It didn't take much convincing. I grabbed my key from the hook, hung it around my neck, headed out to the garage, and then rolled that bike into the driveway and kicked it to life. That little two-stroke engine crackled awake like it had been waiting for me all morning. I shut the garage door behind me and pointed the front tire toward the desert. I had no idea that before the day was over, I'd be making the longest walk of my childhood. Back then, Phoenix was still growing into itself. Entire neighborhoods seemed to end without much warning. One street of finished houses would give way to piles of dirt, stacks of cinder block, and open desert that stretched farther than a 12-year-old could ever hope to explore in a single day. That was all the invitation I needed. Nobody thought much about kids riding dirt bikes back then. Helmets, they were more of a suggestion than a rule. T-shirts, always optional. Canvas sneakers seemed to be the official riding shoe of every kid I knew. If you had a bike, if it ran, then you rode it. It was still fairly early when I headed out, maybe about 9 o'clock. The sun had already started climbing, but the worst of the day's heat was still waiting its turn. At 12 years old, you don't spend much time negotiating with the weather. You just go. The desert had always felt bigger than it was. Every trail seemed to lead somewhere worth seeing. Sometimes, I'd follow a wash just to see where it ended. Other times, I'd pick a hill in the distance and convince myself that there had to be something interesting on the other side. Most of the time there wasn't. But that never really seemed to matter. Half the fun was just exploring. I remember slowing down near a Gila monster that had wandered out onto the trail. He didn't seem the least bit concerned about me. He just stood there with that slow, deliberate confidence they all seemed to have, looking back at me as if I'd interrupted his morning instead of the other way around. It's funny. I used to see Gila monsters all the time. Now I can go years without spotting one. I watched him for a minute, kicked the bike back into gear, and headed deeper into the desert. Farther than I normally rode, not because I had nowhere to be, just because I could. I guess when you're 12, the idea of turning around early rarely crosses your mind. You're always chasing what's over the next hill. It wasn't long after that when I felt the engine stumble. Just a little at first. Almost like it had hiccuped. And then it did it again. And then the bike lost power. It recovered, coughed a little bit more. I let off the throttle and listened. The engine sputtered a few more times and then silence. The only sound left was the crunch of gravel under the tires as the bike coasted to a stop. I remember sitting there for a second with both feet on the ground. The desert had suddenly become very quiet. Looking back, I don't think in that moment I realized the motorcycle had quit. I think I realized I was a whole lot farther from home than I had intended to be. I climbed off the bike and looked it over the same way I'd seen my dad look over a car. Not because I knew what I was doing, but because that's what you did when something quit working. You started looking. I checked the fuel, looked over the fuel filter. I messed around with the carburetor for a while, hoping something obvious would jump out at me, but nothing did. And then I remembered something I'd seen my dad do more than once. If he thought a carburetor had flooded, he'd let the engine sit for a while before trying again. That sounded reasonable enough for me. So I put the kickstand down and went looking for some shade. There wasn't much, just a little Palo Verde tree standing there by itself in the middle of all that open desert. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was enough to get me out of the sun for a few minutes. I leaned back against the trunk and figured I'd give the motorcycle a chance to cool off. It couldn't have been more than a minute or two before I felt something crawling up my leg. Growing up in the desert teaches you a few things. One of them is, you don't wait to identify what's crawling underneath your pants. My hand came down on my pant leg before I even knew what I was hitting. Smack! Only then did I pull the fabric away from my skin to see what had decided to crawl up my pant leg. Ants. Of course, ants. And lots of them. Apparently, I'd chosen their living room without asking first. I brushed the rest of them off, found another place to stand, and decided maybe the shade wasn't really worth the company. After what felt like a long enough wait, I walked back over to the bike, swung my leg over the seat, folded the Kickstarter out. One kick. Nothing. Another. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. I kept kicking until I finally admitted I wasn't accomplishing much besides wearing myself out. So I put the bike in neutral. Thought I could push start it. So I got it rolling as fast as I could, dropped it into gear. The engine coughed, sputtered, made me think it was about to catch. And then nothing. I tried again. Same result. After a while, I stopped counting, because it finally became obvious that the motorcycle wasn't going to be taking me home. It's interesting. Looking back, I don't remember feeling scared. I remember realizing there wasn't anyone to call. Not because I didn't want to, but because there wasn't any way to do it. And even if there had been, I'm not really sure who would have come. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally accepted it. Maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5. Time works differently when you're 12, especially when you're not wearing a watch. I honestly had no idea what time it was. I just knew I was planning to be home sometime around lunch. That opportunity obviously had come and gone. It didn't matter now. The motorcycle wasn't running, home wasn't getting any closer, and nobody was coming to find me. So I did the only thing left to do. I started pushing. The first few 100 yards weren't bad. The ground was mostly level, and I kept thinking maybe I'd spot something I'd missed. I tried push starting it a few more times, hoping that maybe this time it'd fire. It never did. Eventually, I just quit trying. I settled into a rhythm, one hand on the handlebars, the other resting on the seat whenever I needed a break. Step after step. You know, the desert has a way of getting very quiet once the engine stops. No two-stroke buzzing through the washes. No tires throwing dust behind you. Just your footsteps and the sound of rubber rolling over hard-packed dirt. By then, the sun had climbed high enough that there wasn't much shade left anywhere. I don't remember being angry about it, but I do remember being hungry. That surprised me later. You know, lunchtime had come and gone, and whatever excitement had sent me racing into the desert that morning had slowly been replaced by the thought of a bologna sandwich waiting back at the house. Funny the things a 12-year-old starts negotiating with. As the miles wore on, I noticed something else. I stopped sweating. And at the time, it didn't mean much to me. It was just another thing that happened while I kept walking. You know, I'm not so sure looking back that that was actually a good sign. I remember looking down every now and again at my shoes. White canvas Nikes, green stripe down the side. The rubber toes that had started the morning bright white were now covered in a layer of fine desert dust. With every step, another little cloud would puff around them. Every so often, I'd switch sides because one arm had gotten tired, and then I'd switch back again. There really wasn't much to think about anymore. Just the next step, and the one after that. Until eventually, something appeared in the distance. It was a house. Just one. That's all I noticed. It probably wasn't all that far away. But after hours of looking at nothing but dirt and cactus, I knew at that moment I would make it home that evening. Seeing that house changed everything. It didn't matter that I still had a long way to go. For the first time all afternoon, I knew where I was. It's funny how familiar places can give you energy you didn't know that you had. I found myself picking up the pace. Not by much. Just enough to feel that I was making progress a little faster. And when I finally reached the edge of that property, I did what just about every kid would have done back then. I walked straight over to the garden hose. It was one of those green rubber hoses wrapped neatly around the spigot on the side of the house. I don't remember wondering whether I should use it. Back then, you just did. Garbage men drank from the neighborhood hoses. Kids playing baseball did the same thing. To my knowledge, nobody thought twice about it. I turned the faucet. The hose jumped a little as the water rushed through it. The first few seconds were exactly what you'd expect after baking in the Arizona sun all day. Scalding hot. Way too hot to touch. Then came the air bubbles, a little sputtering, and finally, the cold water that had been waiting underground. I don't think I've ever had a drink of water that tasted better. I let it run over my face, over the back of my neck. I soaked my hair until it dripped off the end of my nose. For a minute or two, I just stood there enjoying the feeling of being cool again. You know, looking back, I never would have knocked on their front door. Not because the people inside weren't kind, but it was a different time. At 12 years old, stranger danger had been drilled into us so thoroughly that knocking on a stranger's door simply wasn't something I would have considered doing. The hose, though, that somehow felt different. After a few minutes, I shut the water off, wrapped the hose back around the spigot the way I'd found it, and grabbed the handlebars again. The hard-packed dirt eventually gave way to pavement. Then came familiar streets, houses I'd ridden past hundreds of times, mailboxes I recognized. The little shortcuts kids somehow memorized without ever trying. Home wasn't there yet, but I knew it was coming soon. The blisters forming inside those canvas Nikes didn't seem quite as important anymore. The sunburn, it didn't feel quite as hot. Every familiar street was one less street I had left to walk. And then I rounded the last corner, and there it was. My house. Exactly where I'd left it that morning. The funny thing was, the streetlights, they weren't on yet. And I remember noticing that before anything else. Somehow, after all that walking, after all that sun, after convincing myself I'd never get home, there was actually still daylight left. The driveway was empty. No cars, no movement. The house looked exactly the way it had when I'd left that morning. But for some reason, seeing it made the last few hundred feet seem easier. The blisters on my feet, they were still there. The sunburn, it hadn't magically disappeared. But once you can see the finish line, your body has a way of finding a little bit more to give. I rolled the motorcycle up the driveway and put the kickstand down. For a second, I just stood there looking at it. Neither one of us had had the day we had planned. I reached up, pulled the house key from around my neck, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The first thing I did was kick off those dusty white Nikes. It wasn't because my feet hurt. I mean, they did. But mostly because my mother had a remarkable ability to notice dirt where the rest of us couldn't. There was no sense leaving evidence of my adventure scattered across her clean floors. Some things were just better left alone. I walked straight through the house and into the garage. Opened the big door, pushed that little dirt bike back into its usual spot, closed everything back up, and by the time I finished, the garage looked exactly the way it had that morning. The motorcycle wasn't fixed, but it was home, and so was I. I headed for the backyard. Within seconds, I was standing in nothing but my tidy whities at the edge of the pool. I dove in without giving it a second thought. I can still remember that first moment under the water. The desert disappeared. The heat disappearing. The weight of that motorcycle slipping into the background. For a few seconds, there was nothing to do. Nothing to fix. Nothing to push. I just floated there, letting the cool water hold me up. Eventually, I climbed out, dried off, threw on some clean clothes, and wandered into the kitchen. The bologna sandwich never tasted so good. I grabbed a soda from the refrigerator, flopped down on the couch, and turned the TV on. It was the evening news. Back then, there weren't many choices. You just watched whatever happened to be on, appreciating the company. And about 15 minutes later, I heard the front door open. My mom came in. My sisters followed behind her. Everyone talking about their own day. Nobody asked about mine. Nobody knew where I'd been. Nobody knew I'd spent the better part of an afternoon pushing a broken motorcycle across the desert. It's interesting because, looking back, I don't think I ever told anyone about that day. There wasn't really anything to tell. To me, it was just another summer afternoon. A few weeks ago, as I drove away from that stoplight, I found myself wondering if those boys ever got that e-bike running again. Maybe somebody picked him up. Maybe they fixed it themselves, or maybe they ended up pushing it all the way home. I don't know. Truthfully, though, it doesn't really matter, because I don't think that memory came back to remind me anything about that motorcycle. I don't even think it had anything to do with an e-bike. It reminded me of a time when kids were expected to figure things out. And it wasn't because our parents didn't love us. That's just how life was. If something broke, you dealt with it. If you got lost, you found your way back. If the day didn't go according to the plan, well, you adjusted the plan. I don't think I realized I was learning anything that afternoon. I wasn't intending to build character. I wasn't becoming resilient. I wasn't thinking about life lessons. I was just simply trying to get home. But it's interesting how many of life's big lessons arrive that way. Quietly, without introducing themselves. The sunburn faded after a few days. The blisters healed. And that little dirt bike, it's been long gone by this point. The desert where I rode has mostly become neighborhoods and shopping centers now. You'd probably never know there were dirt trails running through there at one point. But every now and again, I see something that takes me back to that day. 2 kids pushing a broken bicycle. A green garden hose coiled beside a front porch. A pair of dusty canvas sneakers. And for just a moment, I'm 12 years old again. And it's funny, people today talk about resilience like it's something you decide to have. Maybe that's true, I don't really know. But for a lot of us who grew up back then, it never really felt like a choice. It was simply how you got home. And every once in a while, all it takes is seeing two boys laughing while they push a broken bicycle down the side of the road to remember that some of the best lessons you ever learned weren't taught in a classroom. They were learned one dusty step at a time under a July sun with nobody around to solve the problem but you. Thanks for spending time with me today. I really hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed creating it and sharing it with you. Until next time, take notice of ordinary things before they become nothing more than a memory. And as always, I hope that sometime soon, our paths cross somewhere along the way.